Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, Jon Chee. In our last episode, Krish shared stories from his childhood in Chicago, the influence of his father's medical career, and how he ended up attending the University of Illinois before making an unconventional leap into Harvard. If you missed it, check out part 1. In part 2, Chris talks about the moment he decided to leave academia behind and apply his research mindset to venture, joining a small Fund 1 firm just as COVID hit, and treating every investment like an experiment in evidence-based decision-making. He shares how market mapping during lockdown helped him to identify a new category of compute-driven biotech companies before the term even existed. He also discusses getting an MBA and how the experience shaped his approach to firm building, breaking rules when necessary, creating structure from uncertainty, and proving that conviction often matters more than credentials.
So like you had that pivotal moment, you landed that first gig, which kind of like started to open all the doors. And I guess, can you talk a little bit more about how you mentioned how this kind of like shaped you and kind of like set you up for a career in venture? Can you just talk about like those early exercises in these roles that like, or can you give some examples of like how it formed your kind of venture kind of like path?
Yeah, I mean, academic research, as you know, kind of teaches you, how do you take an evidence-based approach to everything, right? Does the data claim? And I think this was something that carried on as a cornerstone of my diligence in venture, right? Is like, does the evidence support the claim? And just answering that question repeatedly. So, there are ups and downs to academia, right? Obviously, there's a very thick glass ceiling in academia. So it's like, great, you got these research positions, but once you get out of academia, nobody cares. Most of the time, the people in academia didn't really care, right? And then you're like, why am I doing all this? Like, I've got all these logos and stuff like that. And here I thought that like some kind of golden door would be open to some portal in the metaverse. Everything's amazing. And you find out, no, that's not really the case. So it's cool. Great. You get a great website. But other than that, nobody cares. But I think, being at the Belfer Center in Taubman and everything, it just like, I was still writing books and everything and doing the regular academic stuff, but just realizing like, I was getting the frustration of like, okay, I'm talking about all this stuff, I'm publishing about it. Once again, that weird urge of that tickle of like, how can I actually start to interventionally apply this, right? And that was the scratch that I couldn't itch, no matter how hard, it was coming on in academia. So like, that was probably the thing where I was like, okay, like I maxed out what I did. I got the institutional affiliations. I published a bunch of stuff. Great. What happens when you do that? And unfortunately, in academia, that's what you do until you die, right? It don't matter. There's nothing left. Like,
Yeah.
I was like, okay, I finished this, and like that was the point where I was like, okay, I wrapped up all these research projects, great, and that was kind of that split. Then I had that option of like, should I go into intelligence or should I go into into venture, right? And at that point in time, right, I was like, okay, which one do I do? And this was like 2019, right before COVID, and the firm I got a job at, was allowing me to be remote. And at that time, there weren't a lot of remote gigs. I was like, dude, I can be in my pajamas all day. And like, they were like, that firm was like, yeah, we want to take the same approach you've taken in academia. We want you to do in venture, but most importantly, give you Play-Doh to build out practices and thesis tests and pressure tests, what you want, right? And that was pretty applicable to me. I was like, wait a minute, like I can actually do what I was talking about in a firm and actually pay off my loans. This is nifty. But once again though, not a fortuitous just all of a sudden swing. I had applied for a zillion other jobs, right? And got rejected from a lot of them. And the CIA's process for interviewing takes a long time, right? So like I was like at the point where I was concerned because I was like, okay, I've got this broad mandate between business and science, but I wasn't like focused on anything specific, right? And so when I was applying to venture and private equity and consulting roles, it was still that exercise of how do I get to know myself more, right? And what I'm actually passionate about, right? And so that was kind of like the foray. But at the end of the day, that's still that foundational element of can I find an industry where I can still apply the fundamentals of my research training, and can I do that and make money off of it? That was kind of the cornerstone. So
And was this Harmonics?
right.
So talk a little bit about just like being like, first day in, you're an analyst, like, what were the early days like?
I mean, I started off at the bottom of the barrel, right? Right? That's it. Like that's the lowest on the totem pole, right? So first day in Harmonics, I was in my pajamas, right? I was remote at a firm, and at that point, I was like, okay, like I joined a firm here. It was a fund one firm, it was a evergreen style fund for the first fund. I was like, that's literally a blank slate, right?
Yep.
So, which is a good and a bad thing, right? We're like, okay, I just came from academia, right? And great, work with all these prominent people and whatever, but now I'm joining a shop that doesn't really have a thesis, but can be molded to one. So I remember, it was a good confluence of events, but like that first year COVID hit, and then all of a sudden biotech became important. And like I was like, okay, at that point, I had already finished, my MBA and my master's in biology. So I was like, okay, I've got good tether on this. And like that first deal,
Or I guess let's pause right there. Hold on. The MBA component.
oh
How did
yeah,
you make time for? So you had your master's in biology. You had two gigs that you were also working. Did you also squeeze in an MBA simultaneously?
correct. So the reason why I went to WashU is because WashU is the only top 20 business school that would allow me to go full time for business school and work full time.
Oh my goodness.
So once again, carrying this whole nexus forward of breaking every single rule and not really doing anything correctly, right? Uh, so, so WashU was like, wait, so you want to go? And so the other thing was like, I wrapped up my projects at the Taubman Center, and I still had an affiliation with the Belfer Center, and then I had to get another position at MIT to supplement the Taubman one, right? So I had two jobs, right? Working at Belfer and MIT in Boston, but then going to do my MBA at Washington St. Louis because I needed to be done effectively in 16 months because my contract with MIT was going to end in 16 months, right? And I had no option. Like once again, coming back to the fundamentals, I have nothing, no other option here. You either have to do it or you don't. And they were like, "This is a 2-year full-time program." I was like, "Correct. Don't really care. We need to ramrod this into 16 months for me, right?" And to WashU's credit, they thought I was insane, but they made it work. And Booth and Kellogg and all those other schools are like, no, that doesn't work, right? So
Yeah.
there's also another caveat. I only applied to one business school because that was the only program that would let me do this, and they were fully aware of it before I applied. I was like, I wanted to introduce to you a paradox situation I'm in to do this, but it needs to be done by this date in this timeline. And so, yeah, so don't also recommend doing that, but also you're starting to see that there's flexibility in graduate school admissions, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
And that's kind of the thing. I think you know, a lot of like people think that the rules are super rigid,
100%.
but they're actually more malleable than you think they are. And you can also if you don't ask, you don't get.
Yep. Correct, right? And I was just testing hypotheses that I didn't even think, because I was also in the rigid framework. I would look at the grad school, requirements and everything and be like, oh my God, I can't do this. It's way too fucking rigid, right? And all of a sudden I'm doing all this MacGyvering duct tape stuff of it's I was like, this is a bit crazy, but whatever, right? At that
Yeah.
point, I was like, okay, let's give it a whirl, right? But once again, I only did it because I had conviction. I did it as a way of like, I had the leverage on my end. I was like, because essentially I told the institution, I was like, I have to do it this way. We have to come to a thing. And like, I had zero power to do that, but it was just because I just was like, this is what I have to do. So, yeah.
And it's infectious. It's infectious. Like, I think people can like get that read. Like,
right.
They can read that.
Because there are so many people that are like, oh man, if I like, this is the rules. And if I don't do them, then that's it. And it's weird that like, if you get to know certain people or whatever, the rules become more malleable, but also just because nobody ever had the conviction to push their hand through the screen.
Yeah.
There is, this like, but also like you had to be calibrated to get to that point to understand that, right? Would I recommend somebody just do that from 0 to 1? Absolutely not.
No. Yeah. No.
Just look like an idiot, right?
Yeah. But I do love that, because I think sometimes I think too, especially in like company building, firm building, like everyone wants a playbook. Like, everyone just like loves ingesting like, oh yeah, here's like the playbook from someone else. It's just like, yo, that's someone else's playbook. By no means do you have to like abide by that. Like, you can just like rip it up and just like go do it a different way. That's also okay. Because I think sometimes people just like take it too literally. Like, and you get and you just get the same results.
No.
Ultimately.
And the other thing is like, why would I want to live somebody else's story, right? That playbook, I like, no offense to all my consulting friends, they're like all clones of each other. Like they're all doing it. I was like, what is your point of existence, right? Like seriously, because I'm just, you guys are doing the same thing. Even your mannerisms and everything are all the same. I was like, what is the context here for you actually being a human that actually has their own, functional baseline for existence? Like, a lot of people do the same thing. Like, there's no problem with complacency and being in the system and be like, okay, I'm going to go to Bain or McKinsey, hate my life for 20 years, but then like be fine, right? Like, great. But like, I find that that's not conducive. Like, there's a zillion other people doing that, right? Like,
totally. And so, okay, you've completed the kind of like the sprint marathon of grad school. You're now at Harmonics. You're blank slate analyst. You were mentioning that it was like both a blessing and a curse that it was like a blank slate. Talk a little bit more about that.
So when I joined the firm there, like I said, it was like Play-Doh. And I think the biggest thing was like, here's something like I can either do this super well, and just go with it and just not really do a fake it till you make it, but let me just take the tools that I had from academia and apply this and see if this actually works, right? So I mean, what I did was, the first time I joined, first day I was like started just mapping, right? Like, what are the areas I'm excited about and areas that I think alpha can be derived from, and then like go from the fundamentals off of that. And as when I was market mapping, one of the biggest things that I do in that exercise is like, it's like situational awareness. It's like, okay, think tank. All right, here's the problem, right, of this market area. Can I find a solution, i.e. the companies? And then within that solution element, can that become, a 10x plus return for the firm, right? And do that across different verticals, right? So like in one of the most interesting things, like, with COVID and everything, if anything, it amplified the focus, right? Because now I'm like, okay, I'm at home all day. Like, I'm sitting here on this. I can thesis map and have the same, just go like full tilt, right? And that's exactly what I did. Like, I started market mapping each one of the ologies in healthcare, and then each one of the prescriptive domains in life sciences when it came to high unmet patient need, modalities, everything. But what was interesting at that time, I started realizing, like, what do all these companies have in common that I'm looking for that are actually identifying? And this was kind of the big breakthrough of like, the first year of me being an analyst. I was like, oh, these are all compute architecture companies, right? Like, they're all using compute to actually accelerate a redundant R&D process and get to a better, faster, cheaper outcome. It's like, this is unique. All right, I've found like a unique kind of solution of essentially what would be the platform for AI native modalities, right? And like, this was before TechBio was a thing and everything.
Yep.
Like,
Yep.
Mixed in computer, right? And like those first set of investments that I did were like Insilico Medicine and Rad AI and Syntax and like volumetric biotechnologies, a lot of companies that would be super successful, but like realizing that like there was something here, but I didn't know what it was. And once again, going back to the literature, refining it and being like, okay, so these companies do have this compute thing that's actually doing it. Here's the evidence in the clinical outcome or the ARR tracking or whatever, but like it was identifying that kind of new breed of company, and then taking that thesis and presenting it to the partnership and being like, well, I think there's alpha here, right? And when the markets were in free fall during COVID, it was perfect because it was like, what better time to allocate capital when everybody else is scared, right? That first year, God, I did 12 investments that calendar year, right? Yeah, exactly. So once again, breaking the entire prescriptive mold of anything, right? Should an analyst be doing 12 investments? Absolutely not. Analysts don't touch stuff most of the time, right? Like you're doing the diligence, Monty, right? You're just doing stuff into perpetuity. But I think this was where my academic training helped really nicely, is because I built basically a thesis in a workbook, and I presented that workbook after the first quarter of me being at the firm, and that workbook was essentially like Lord of the Rings on crack, right? This is where Frodo's at. This is how we destroy the Ring of Power, right?
Yeah.
And when you provide it in a way that's like conducive in actually showing there's actually a full thought process here in a structured allocation, and this wrapped into portfolio allocation analysis that I've been doing at USAID and how to actually build a diversified portfolio in subdomains, right? So it was kind of weird that the academic training was feeding into how do I build out a portfolio, how do I allocate, how do I thesis map, how do I mix the think tank stuff together, and blah blah blah, right? So that was coming together, and then all of a sudden, all right, now I'm jocking deals, and then I was like, okay, cool, like we've got something here. Like, because when I had joined, the firm was Fund One. They only had like 7 positions, and it was like scattered. It was a bunch of random stuff. It wasn't like an actual portfolio. And then once I came on board, that's when all of a sudden you're building out asset classes, or not specific subdomains within that asset class and portfolio, right? And then it's becoming actually structured now. And then so I did that, and then that was year one. And I was like, do I recommend that either? Absolutely not, right? Because I basically sold my soul to the devil, right? Like I went full tilt that year, right? That was 80-hour work weeks, everything, just because I was, for some reason, just perpetually actually curious, but also like being like, this is a good time to strike, right? And then that set the basis for why I ramped from an analyst to a partner also in an obscene amount of time, which I don't recommend as well. Right? So what you're saying is the asterisks are stacking up on each other.
Yeah.
It looks amazing, but then you're like, holy this, who knows?
I guess so from, I'm going to imagine there's kind of a couple steps there, right? Like you became a senior associate and then principal and then I believe partner after that. Was that like a very kind of like blended gradient, or were there like distinct changes at each of those kind of roles or promotions?
It's interesting because one of the biggest problems in venture is shot calling, right? Where if you're really good at what you do and you call your deals and you own those deals, right? And that's why a lot of my friends get stuck at associate or principal position, right? Because they didn't have the conviction to call out.
Oh, because they didn't shot call.
Yeah, exactly. They weren't like, I did this deal. This is, instead they kind of kissed ass and been like, well, this partner helped me on it. And then we shared the deal, right? And it was like, I was not like that. I was like, I think I'm good at this because I basically did the output of an entire firm by myself.
Yeah.
The first 2 years.
That's really interesting because sorry to interrupt, but my co-founder was one of the first employees or very early employees at Alpine Investors, the private equity firm in San Francisco. And he did the same thing. Just shot called and went super hard in the very beginning. And that kind of opened up a ton. I'm not in that space and in that space, so I didn't know that was shot calling was so critical. But now that I'm hearing it, oh, that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, and in general, right? I think like a lot of people are more like they're always expecting people to be aware of your successes, right? And I was like, unfortunately, human beings are quite selfish, right? Like
Yeah.
all the thoughts you have in your head, the other person is not thinking about that at all. I know, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
anxiety 101. Oh, those thoughts you thought about that person that thought about you were not even in the same. That person was thinking about mac and cheese, not
Yeah.
about the email they sent without the emoji, right? So, right.
Yeah.
So,
So you're like, you went from like, I mean, it sounds like you were shot calling even at the analyst role, but like senior associate, what was it like transitioning to that?
yeah. So basically, the senior associate thing came on because I was like, well, I already have an MBA. I shouldn't be an analyst, right? But like, so, and then our chief of staff was like, so then what title do you want? I was like, senior associate, you
Yeah,
know,
no,
like,
go with that.
right? And I was like, at that point, I had clipped 2 years, and I was like, okay, now I have actual 2 years of actual venture experience.
Yeah.
The MBA, which would classify me traditionally as a senior associate. So, hence the skip on senior analyst and associate.
Yeah.
Right. So,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
and it's funny because I got parked in the senior associate position really pretty quickly as well, because at that point, like, since I had already made those first set of investments and everything, I was like, I'm actually doing more work than a senior associate would be doing, right? Because in senior associate is you're just analyzing, putting memos. You're not actually pushing deals through or anything, right? So it's funny how that manifestation, as soon as I got parked in that slot, our chief of staff was like, I'm looking at like your scheduled agenda. I was like, you're doing more than a senior associate would be like, and it's like, you should be a principal, right? Because at that point, like I was also beginning to take board observer positions with the companies, and that would be more conducive to a principal, right? And then also, by year three, your bets that you started making early on start stepping up, right? And at that point, I was like, okay, I'm getting solid markups here. I know what the hell I'm doing, right? That should be a principal, right? So hence that kind of thing. So it was mainly because like I was like, let me do the work that's required for the next role now, because then when that conversation comes, I could be like, I'm already doing this.
Yeah. It's kind of like taking your grad school class while you were an undergrad.
Like, so do I recommend that as well? No. But like, it's funny how like then you're like, it just becomes obvious, right?
Yeah.
Like, right. So I didn't have to do like a performance review or anything, because I was like, I'm already doing this. Just give me the title.
That's so funny because like this story reminds me even more of my co-founder because he in finance there's like super rigid like tracks. There's like recruiting cycles and all this stuff. And he was like, screw that. I'm so fine.
Right.
Screw that. And you like, I guess like the popular track is like you go the iBanking route, and then you kind of like, from after iBanking, you move on to whatever buy side stuff. But he was like, screw the iBanking. I'm just gonna do hedge fund things now.
Right.
And then and it worked. Like it just worked. He was just like, yeah, I'm just gonna I'm gonna do that. And then it's kind of like doing the work that I like how you described it as like the work that you kind of like where you want to be. You just do it now. And people are like, oh, great, you're already doing it. It's just like, let's plug you in.
But it takes a different kind of person and foresight to do that, because not a lot of people are comfortable, right? Like, and it comes back to that rigidity coefficient, right? Of some people are like, well, this is predefined. I have to operate in this role, right? And which is a good and a bad thing, because you need to have conviction and direction, right, to be able to push the mold outside of it. If you don't, then you're better off just staying in.
Yeah. Yep.
But yeah, it's a good kind of manifestation exercise, I think of it, like, right? Because if you're already doing it, then you're like, I already had the partner kind of line of sight closed in, because I was like, oh, what do I need to do to be a partner? Well, all I need to do is just talk to LPs, right?
Is that the difference? Is that like, so like principal, you're getting board observer roles, you're kind of like getting a bit more hands-on kind of with companies, and then when you become a principal, it's like you just have to go fundraise pretty much.
Yeah. So the hardest attrition, right, is principal to partner, right? Because the carry pool is limited, right? And you're not going to make partner unless you have a track record, right? And that was very important. So I wasn't able to shotgun call to partner until I started getting step ups and exits with the investments, right? Otherwise, it would have just been like you're tapped out, right? Because you don't get, I mean, you get some carry as a principal, but you're not getting a substantial proportion until your partner, right? And also being like, okay, well, I'm realizing that my theses that I developed here are now being pitched to LPs, right? And I was like, well, then those are my theses. And once again, a shotgun call of like, that's my stuff. I should be on the calls then, right?
Yeah.
And once again, force them to make me a partner because I was like, you're pitching my strategy,
That was me, dog. Like,
right? And
don't
like,
regurgitate my stuff.
but it's funny because I was doing that. It was a good, I always like to call it a ball dropping exercise, right? Because I was always a people pleaser, right? And I was like, oh, I'm doing this, but also realizing when does the buck stop, right, on that? Because you can only do that so long before you're realizing, okay, this is my stuff. I got to own it, right? And do it in a way that isn't asshole-ish, but in a way that does show that, like, hey, like, I'm once again calling my wins and I should be on this level framework. And that was a conversation that, like, it's a bit of whiplash because some people take it the wrong way, right? Because I'd be like, I busted my ass off, I built off these theses, this is my win. And some people get insecure about that, right? Like, so it's a very delicate dance, right, on that. Like, how do you do it in a way? And there was still problems. Like, I was like, man, like, if this is my thesis, I should be even higher, like, and getting paid way more, right? And that's kind of what ultimately led me to transition to another firm, right? But like, but yeah, well, it's quite interesting on that because some people are just like, oh man, should I be doing this? Is this too boisterous? And I was like, no, you're just creating situational awareness for other people and be like, I'm doing this, right? So, and it's hard to refute, right? So,
How was the transition to partner and having to go fundraise? I guess that's like, because here's that's an, founders, nowadays, no, but like, back in the day when like you're raising, like when before the internet and like you had to go down to Sand Hill Road and like go like bang on doors, like there's more of this like black box element to like what ventures like, but like founders do know that like VCs have to go fundraise too. Like, how was that experience?
it's funny because I always tell founders, I was like, at least VCs have a working website and stuff like that. Our LP, they pay to be off the internet, barely have a working email, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny, it's like you're talking to ghosts essentially that manage the most amount of money on planet Earth but never want to be found, right?
Yeah.
Pretty wild. So I think like, and we were fundraising, during COVID, right? Like in LPs, as you know, don't cut checks. They're old school, right? This is a very high touch business. And it was like doing a virtual raise. Like, is that even a thing, right? Like,
Yeah.
So I think like that was the hardest part, right? Because then you go from, I think of it as like, it's like going from a CTO to a CEO, right? You're super technical. Now you have to figure out how do I speak the LP lingo, right? Which is
Yup.
totally different lingo, right? You're selling something then, right? And it's not like most scientists, you're not trained to sell stuff. You're just trained to call, a spade, right? So, and I think that was the hardest part of being like, okay, like now I have this opaque system of talking to people, but then I have to figure out how do I actually market myself, right? And this was a very good exercise, probably the best learnings I got. It was like I actually started to realize how do I actually sell myself, right? Because that's what else they were investing in a jockey, right? And that was an exercise I'd never really done because normally, like, I was calling my wins, but I was calling my wins to myself and two other people. I was not calling my wins to the population at large, right, on a consistent basis, right? And it actually very much helped with kind of an anchor exercise of being like, well, I'm pretty good at this stuff, but like also understanding this is how all VCs get an ego because they're talking about how great they are during the capital raise nonstop, right?
It's that feedback loop, just like,
Right? And I was like, but and that's why you kind of see the cockiness of it and everything because you have to, you're selling yourself to 100 LPs and two of them might write you a check, right? And you're doing that every 3 years, like clockwork, right? So,
I guess like a question for you, like, there's like tons of different types of LPs, and I'm sure like talking to different LPs takes a different kind of, again, you talked about the language, like, I guess for those out there who may not be aware, like, what is the universe, like these ghosts, what type of like buckets do they fall into, or like segments, like what is an archetypical LP, and I guess kind of, and where do they fall?
Yeah, I mean, so the hardest things for venture, right, are the emerging manager bucket. So everybody knows, statistically speaking, the first three funds will outperform any other fund, right? Because the manager is squeezed for capital. You have to get, substantial returns. Otherwise, you're just not going to attract enough to get to the next fund, right? So, LPs come in all shapes and sizes and forms, but like typically emerging funds, right, are going to raise from, multifamily offices, single family offices, and ultra high net worths. And then your goal is to eventually pivot out of the emerging manager bucket into fund 4 and beyond, which are when you actually have an established track record, rinse and repeatable strategy, and you become institutional back, right? And that's kind of the
and you're considered emerging when you're in the first three.
Correct, right. So every manager, you'll see why they're hell-bent on getting out of that bucket, right? Because your capital source is extremely constrained, right? Because you're taking bets on somebody that you don't know, right? But this is also why you see the Icarus phenomenon with a lot of managers where they'll raise super quickly, multiple funds, stack the management fees, and then utterly collapse, right? Because they actually didn't have a robust, repeatable strategy, right? And I think most venture managers forget that they're asset managers, right? Like you're not just hanging out on Twitter all day. You actually we have to build, and I think this is good. Like this is great for our firm because we're institutionally backed emerging fund, which is extremely rare, right? And the institutionals put you through the full gamut, right, of diligence, reporting, all of that stuff, right? And you have to put your big boy pants on immediately. You have 3 funds to do that in a progressive way, right? And that's the kill point. I mean, that's why last year we saw 40% of venture funds die, right? Because they just didn't have an institutional grade book. And really robust strategy that's differentiated, but also the returns, right? As venture returns are horrible, right? And oftentimes you're better off putting your money in an S&P 500 index fund. So most LPs are already conscripted to only investing in top quartile performing managers, right? And that's why you see the same logos being backed all of the time, right? Because if you're not top quartile performing in venture, that's it. You're not getting alpha, right? And that leads to that stratification of capital where 10% of managers are getting 90% of capital, right? And that's what we're seeing these days, right? Everybody's AI adjacent. There's a lot of people now raising AI funds, but problem is if you want LPs value a strategy that is a 20, 30-year relationship of the same playbook, rinse and repeated, and that's it. You don't deviate, you don't get what's called drift, right? Where all of a sudden you're changing allocation structures and mandates and everything. And that's where a lot of managers kind of screw up. And also the other thing is in this business, you're only as good as your last deal, right?
Yeah.
If you had a bad route and your fund is performing terribly, unfortunately, it's a lot of times LPs will just be great, that's it, we're done, right? So you have to be on edge, right? But the LPs, that opaque, capitalization is what's set up the curve for investing in innovation in America, right? And the other thing is if you add up all the venture funds in the United States, they're less than the holdings of BlackRock. It's still a very hyper niche asset class.
Venture just has a loudspeaker. It's the loudest checks, but then
right, but they're the smallest.
They're the smallest but loudest. That tends to be the case because you go look at BlackRock, you go look at Blackstone. It's that's massive, massive checks. Right. I guess the question for you is at Harmonics, when you got promoted to partner, were you guys in the fund 1 through 3 zone at that point?
Yeah. So we were, we wrapped up fund 1, and then we were in fund 2 and deploying out of that vehicle. The hardest fund, ironically raised, is actually fund 3, right? Because fund 3 is when you get to the point where there's actually a track record.
Yep.
Fund 2, right? Otherwise LPs are you're raising your fund 2 off of a couple good bets in fund 1, but nothing actually materialized, right? And then fund 4, it's always the next fund is based on your fund 2 funds ago. So fund 4, fund 2, so etc. So.
Oh, and so, okay, so you crossed the chasm at Harmonics. You went to the fund 4?
No, so I only got to Fund 3, and then I cycled out of that into AIX. So
Got it.
That's all for this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast featuring Krish Ramadurai. Join us next time for part 3, where Krish recounts studying nanomedicine at Oxford while investing full-time, how he navigated Oxford's tutorial system, and what his mRNA research focused on. He'll also unpack the trade-offs and boundaries that came with operating at that pace, his pursuit of becoming a general partner, and how he found his people at AIX Ventures, alongside advisory work with Nucleate and ARPAH. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe, leave a review, or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening, and see you next time. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Exceeder provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.exceeder.com. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Exceeder or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Exceeder or its guests.